for the past almost 8 years, I've been the Deputy Regional Administrator for the Southeast region, working for Roy Crabtree. Anybody who's worked with the councils, I'm sure is very familiar with Roy. But really for the past 4 years, I have been working more for NOAA in terms of this cross-NOAA effort called regional collaboration. And so really I've been spending much more of my time working collaboratively through the Gulf Alliance and with Bryon, and but also the other parts of all different parts of NOAA. So the Weather Service, the Ocean Service, a lot of folks from all different parts of NOAA. So anyway, the reason that I wanted to point that out is because in the recovery from this event is going to require all resources and a coordination of that. We're going to talk about 3 or 4 different types of activities that are going on right now, and trying to answer some of the questions that were posed to us. I think one thing I'd like to ask of you, and that is, a lot of these things are just starting. The Mavis restoration effort, the NERDA process now is into its out of its initial phase into now the fact-finding, into the real work of what's going to happen over the next few years. But also the administration's national ocean policy has a huge part of restoration associated with it. And so it would be easy for us to take kind of a disjointed viewpoint of all those and work on them in parallel rather than integrated. And I think that this is where your guys' organizations can really be of help, and that is to just to be a little bit familiar with, or very familiar with, all the different aspects. And I'll try to cover some of them in here in these slides real quick, but I think that's where the power of collaborative efforts are going to happen, because this is not going to be just a federal effort. It's not going to be just a state effort or a university effort or NGO effort. This is going to, in a very real sense, is going to have to be all of our responsibility, and it's going to take all different pieces playing together to really make things happen, because most of the times we get, of course, settled into doing the way of business that we've always done, and so it develops a tremendous amount of momentum in a certain direction. This event really has really upset the cart, so to speak, of how we've traditionally done things, and I think that that's a good thing in that regard. Now, the event wasn't good, obviously, but if we can learn from it and learn how to work better together, I think then we can get some traction for moving ahead. So if I got the next slide, these are just some of the things that NOAA is doing. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Natural Resources Damage Assessment, NERDA. I'll try to maintain Sin's directive on no acronyms. This is a very powerful tool, and we're all part of it, whether you're part of the federal government with the trustees, or whether you're a state, because they're a trustee as well, or citizens, because we're all have responsibility to have input, and we'll have opportunity to have input. So it's one that it's an important one to be familiar with. There's all kinds of information up on the web about it, but in essence, these are the main drivers of what it's about. It was created really as part of in the wake of the Exxon Valdez, and try to give some structure of how to respond to oil spills. They've used this NERDA process, hundreds and hundreds of times over the past years, but for small spills. I mean, there is no small spill, but for spills much smaller than this, this horrific thing that happened this past summer. But these are the players that are in it, and I did mention that the pre-assessment was done, and there's all the data that was collected as part of that is on this website right here. And so, again, I don't know if you can see it, but I'll leave my card here, and I can certainly provide any information that I possibly can. Have the next slide. This is basically a kind of a diagrammatic process of how it goes through. It is prescriptive in the sense that it goes through certain steps, but it's a very public process, including the National Environmental Policy Act as part of it, NEPA, I'm sure. So there's a public process involved with that. There's a public process in determining what the extent of that process is. But again, the NERDA is important to remind, is to get things back to where they were before the spill. The MABUS report, or the Gulf Restoration Initiative, is a broader perspective, and we'll get into that in a second, but they're not the same. MABUS talks about influencing NERDA, but NERDA is a very legal, directed process with a very prescribed protocols. So kind of the next slide. Now this is what America's Gulf Coast, the long-term recovery plan, this is the MABUS report. One of the things that is an unknown factor, obviously, is that when this thing came out, I understand that they may be signing an executive order today or sometime soon, implementing this. And Lisa Jackson of the EPA is the head of this ecosystem task force, which they also have a regional component, but there's no money that was associated with it. So one of the things that has been suggested is to take some of the fines that are based on the process under the Clean Water Act, which has a lot of different variables in it, but basically will provide some money that usually just goes back into a fund that to work for the next oil spill. So the suggestion is that Congress think about changing that rule to allow the funds, or at least a portion of those funds collected under the Clean Water Act fines, to be used for a restoration effort. So that's a political process, and certainly one that I think bears paying attention to. Like I said, let's go to the next slide here. So how do we, this is, I should probably let Bryon talk about this because he's been involved with the Gulf of Mexico Alliance for a long time. And the reason I'm talking about it, and you're probably wondering, why is this guy from fisheries or from NOAA talking about this state-led alliance? And that is because, in my sense, the impacts of this spill had coastal impacts and certainly had offshore impacts, and impacts that we're not even really aware of yet. And we're going to have to look into that. We are looking into it, but certainly where we all live along the coast, and the Gulf of Mexico Alliance is a partnership that it certainly has gained a lot of attention over the last few years. And Bryon, maybe you're the expert on this, and Bryon and I are co-leads for the federal government for the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, but Bryon has been involved much longer than I have. So,
before I get into that, why don't I give the same kind of background opening, since there are a lot of folks in this particular audience, which is actually rare for me, that I've not met before. This will be my 32nd year in federal government, all of it primarily with EPA, a short stint with USDA. But I'm a transplant native of the region. In fact, my mother was from Gulfport, my father from Birmingham, my wife from New Orleans, the Gentilly area. I have been with the Gulf of Mexico program, as Cynthia pointed out, certainly since she started in the GRN, but I started actually 20 years ago last month, as kind of an anniversary date for me. For me, of course, that means a lot of things that I'll portray in my own opening discussion to try to tee up the Q&A session. I was selected I led most of that time as the deputy director. I was selected to the executive director position approximately 8 years ago. In the course of developments in the Gulf region, I'm going to lead to the MABUS plan, what at least I perceive, and I think many would perceive in the MABUS plan, is to recognize that the Gulf was imperiled with many issues long before the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in April. And you all, from your respective organizations, know those only too well. The problem for the region is and hopefully will result in this particular initiative a new beginning for the Gulf, and that's a level of attention and awareness to the details about what it takes actually to sustain the coastal ecosystem, ultimately both the economy and the ecology, goes beyond just the measures that would be taken in the NERDA process, and that's full Gulf Coast restoration. And so as a consequence, the efforts that have been undertaken in similar areas, why was EPA's administrator, why was EPA selected to lead the task force? Of course, neither Buck or I were there for that decision, but it's actually pretty natural. EPA has both the science and operations mission and authorities to stand up the programmatic structures and underpinnings, which they have in the Great Lakes and the Chesapeake and the Pacific Northwest and all the others that you know only too well. It is actually very serendipitous that the administrator is also from, largely raised within the New Orleans area and has a very strong direct tie to the region to get that particular responsibility at the very same time that EPA was selected to lead the task force. In doing so, again, the Gulf Coast Restoration Task Force, the challenge is to merge the pieces. As we'll get to this slide that Buck handed over to me. Back in the previous administration, I want you all to think about previous administrations, and then I want you to think about future administrations because there will be innumerable ones. In the previous administration, the continued focus on how important both the oceans and the Gulf were led to the development of what's known as the Gulf of Mexico States Governors Alliance, or Gulf Alliance for short. The intent was to go into a management model and experiment on a states-led, federally supported framework for Gulf Coast restoration and sustainability. That effort proved to be extremely successful in what I would describe to you as one of four primary foundation building matters for really putting together a framework in a region that will actually be sustainable through the long haul and actually get to some of the toughest details. One is it brought regionalization to the state level in this particular area that had never been achieved before, ever. And to the consequence of looking down the puzzle and actually coming to consensus across 5 states on what the priorities were and are today, relative to what was then viewed as a limited level of resource that could go into that. These are states, like all over the country, dealing with both the environmental insults as well as schools, roads, furloughs at the local governance levels, and all the things that we read about. So this was actually an amazing accomplishment for the region. And it was an amazing accomplishment from the standpoint that it did 2 things. It allowed not only just a level of dialogue, but a level of implementation dialogue at the region level that led to the most successful planning and implementation ever that's been executed at the coastal level. It was, again, gauged to those resources that were perceived to be available to be factored in. The region still suffered from identity in the grander scheme of things, to the consequence of the resources at risk and what those really meant not only to the region but to the nation. Hence the effect of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill brought obviously the region to both the national and international spotlight.